In a world where hustle culture collides with wellness warnings and workplace demands keep evolving, how do we stay sharp without burning out? How do we navigate the endless stream of wellness trends while actually getting results? This is the Work and Wellness Podcast, and I'm your host, Ange Davies. Drawing from my own journey of wins, stumbles, and honest revelations, I'll be bringing you raw, unfiltered conversations with experts and inspiring guests who've been there, lived it, and found a better way. Together, we'll cut through the noise and workshop what it really means to be well in today's workplace. No more choosing between success and sanity. No more sacrificing health for achievement. Whether you're struggling with burnout, searching for purpose, or simply ready to work smarter, not harder, you're in the right place. This is real talk about real solutions for real people. Let's get into it. Hello friends, welcome to the show. Today I am excited to welcome Ash Semmens to the podcast. Growing up in Adelaide, Ash turned his passion for water sports into a distinguished career as a Navy clearance diver, where his journey includes surviving a Taliban attack, navigating the challenges of PTSD, and transforming those experiences into advocacy for mental health and resilience, two topics that are very close to my heart. Following on from his time in the Navy, Ash is co-founder of We Rise, where he's dedicated to helping others build strength through vulnerability, which again, super important. Ash is also a long time and very dear friend of my husband Liam and a mate of mine as well. And today we're going to dive into his incredible journey. We're exploring the lessons he's learned and looking to uncover tips for cultivating a strong mindset and well-being at work. Welcome to the show, Ash.
Thanks, Ange. Really happy to be here.
I can't wait to dive into this, Ash. I'm looking forward to catching up on the podcast and learning a little bit more about your journey, talking more about what you're doing now. You're doing some really cool things, how people can sort of apply that to their work, their careers. But I want to start a little bit more chronologically and start back at the start of your journey. Growing up, I know you were a competitive swimmer and really into water sports. How did that prepare you for the mental and physical challenges of being a Navy clearance diver?
Yeah, it's actually quite a funny question when we get into the real deep nuts and guts of it. That my first experience really in the water and in the pool was as a toddler, sort of 2 or 3. I have no memory of this, but I've been walked through it intimately with my parents a number of times. That my first swimming lesson as a kid, I was taken to a local pool, given to the swimming instructor, and his response was to take me to the edge and effectively just piff me in the pool. As a young child, obviously no idea how to swim, and his quote to my parents was, "He'll either sink or swim." And as expected, I sunk straight to the bottom. So interestingly, he jumped in, and that was my introduction to the water and to the lessons of life, really. That it was kind of a nice metaphor for life, that you will either sink or swim, and you have to figure it out yourself. Moving on from there, I spent a lot of time in surf clubs from, again, a young age. And had quite a lot of success competitively in sort of more the beach events, which if you look at those sort of competitive arenas, particularly surf lifesaving, they're the lesser of the events. The water sports is the premier area where you want to be doing well. So I recognised that and realised I wasn't confident in the water, I wasn't performing. And as a sort of 7, 8, 9-year-old, I realised quite quickly that I needed to put in the hard work and find a way to get better at these things. And that looked like going and jumping in the pool and learning to swim, learning to sort of master the art of being in the marine environment. And that led through to those competitive swimming years through my later teens, where that value of hard work that I recognised as a young child really paid off to the point where I was fortunate enough to win an open gold medal. So it looked like the best 800-metre swimmer in Australia at one point. Context is important in that it was an off-Olympic year, so people like Grant Hackett, Ian Thorpe, those guys were having a bit of a rest and travelling the world. and us sort of B grade competitors were still slogging away. So that gave me the chance to have a good win, and again reinforced that value that those 10 years of hard work finally paid off and instilled those theories and ideas of if you do put in those kilometres in the pool or those hours in whatever you're doing, you will get the results. So to answer your question as how that looked moving into my professional career as a clearance diver, um, I, I alluded to investing in yourself. Um, I became very, very good in the water because I put the time in, hours and hours of in the ocean, in the pool. I sought mentors, being my swimming coach at the time, who was my probably the most important male mentor that I've had in my life. I got a lot of lessons from him very early on that I still sort of live to this day.
I want to touch on, I guess, obviously you going into the clearance diving world, it's a pretty high pressure, high performing environment. Obviously, my husband Liam was a clearance diver with you, so I know a little bit about what it is. But for the listeners who don't know what a clearance diver is, can you explain what a clearance diver does? And secondly, what are the mindset and skills that you feel like are key to thriving in a really demanding role like that?
Yeah, definitely, and that's a huge question to unpack. Particularly the roles of a clearance diver, and it's evolved over the last sort of 70 years that they've been involved. But in my opinion, and opinions change for people and what they find their niches as in the role. But in my opinion, the clearance diver's primary role is to locate, identify, neutralise, recover, and dispose of maritime ordnance. So whether that's torpedoes, sea mines, any sort of explosive in the maritime environment, that's our bread and butter. That's what we were originally built to do. Now that's evolved massively, and one of our sort of unofficial mottos is adapt and overcome. And we've been very good at doing that. And the Navy and the ADF has employed clearance divers in a massive role when you're looking at conducting covert and overt sort of diving profiles and missions, conducting explosive ordnance, be that in the maritime environment or in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. And then you throw in the complexities of IEDs that are obviously used quite regularly, moving into domestic counterterrorism situations, and then even sort of complex national and international boardings where you're looking at targeting drug smugglers, weapon smugglers, people smugglers, and then even closer to home, sort of illegal immigrants and illegal fishing within Australia. So the gamut of what a clearance diver looks like is just so broad. So the people that are employed in this environment need to be on the ball. That it could be that one day you're doing a basic scuba diving mission, and then the next day you're being sent to the coast of Africa to board a suspected drug vessel. So you need to be sort of switched on, and that talks about those mindsets and skills that you asked. And you look at like the mental toughness of a clearance diver. A basic diving profile could be hours, sort of 5, 6, 7 hours in the water. And some of that could be you're just static, sitting there waiting. So to sit in one position, waiting for the rest of the team to come back and join you after they've been out doing what they need to be doing, there's a mental toughness in sitting in one spot in complete pitch black ocean, the temperature, the environment, the let's call marine animals that are often in these areas. Which is obviously one of my greatest fears that your husband Liam often used to play on with me. But these things are ever present, and you have to find a way to deal with them. Moving into, you look at problem solving and critical thinking. These are high pressure situations like domestic counterterrorism. When you're walking into a room and you have to understand who is a hostage and who is a potential terrorist in those situations and make split second decisions. When you're defusing a bomb, these are real time decision making that can literally life and death situations. Emotional control. When you're doing these things, you need to put your emotions to the side and make clear decisions that will allow that mission the success or the failure. And that can be a split-second decision, but you have to maintain that clarity of thought. Even look at teamwork and leadership. Small teams of, it could be 2 people, or it could be up to 10, 12, 15. And there almost needs to be that level of communication that I can look at one of my team members and communicate exactly what I need. So when you talk about communication and how much body language plays into that, like you're looking at 90% of communication is body language, and that can be, like I said, just that one look of go or stop or yes do that or don't do. All these things they play in. I could talk all day about personal
Yeah.
traits,
How do
motivation.
you how do you develop these traits, Ash? Because thinking about sort of you go into this role. Obviously, it's quite a big selection course that you've got to go through to get in there.
Mm.
But how did you develop these traits that are required for such a high pressure role? Because even though the corporate world is quite different to what you were doing in a high pressure role, these traits are still required, right? You need that level of communication, teamwork, strength, grit, resilience in certain high pressure roles. How do you develop those, and how do you sort of see yourself being able to take those as you've transitioned out of the military?
Yeah, completely agree that there's so many similarities between sort of the corporate world and military, and I think a lot of them are inherent in the individuals. Like your experiences form your knowledge and your
Mm.
opinions. So, like I alluded to earlier, like my first experience was being thrown in the water and getting out, and they continued throughout my life, putting myself in challenging, potentially dangerous situations, sort of an 80s and 90s kid where I had the freedom to go and find myself and put myself in situations that weren't necessarily ideal, and I had to get myself out. It wasn't that I wasn't wrapped in cotton wool. I had those sort of helicopter
Mm.
parents. So I think that's important to um, gain those experiences and give them to our kids, find those independence and allow them to have that independence in a safe environment.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think so many of those skills come across into, your work now, right? In
mm,
sort of working with teams on how they can develop those skills in high pressure environments. And I'm going to come back to that later, but I want to just dive a little bit deeper on your experience in the military, if you're
uh,
okay with that.
for sure.
And I know you survived a Taliban attack. And for most, the closest experience we'd have to imagining anything like that is watching a movie. It would be hard to imagine what it would even be like. But what was your mental journey in processing that moment and its aftermath?
Yeah, really interesting one, and I've obviously spent a lot of time throughout my life since that particular day. So being blown up by a roadside bomb, Taliban roadside bomb or IED, I've unpacked that a lot. And initially, I found it very very easily. You're in the moment. There's jobs to do. After being blown up, we actually patrolled out, found a big weapons cache, had to secure the area. There was quite a few suspected Taliban around, so you have to compartmentalize in that situation. Pack
Mm.
away what's just happened, pack away your emotions, and continue to get on with the job, with the mission, because there's no room for emotion at that time. That leads to further dangerous situations, to making bad decisions. My take on it at the time and my approach was to continue compartmentalizing. The problem with that was that sooner or later that's going to explode. I didn't
Mm.
have the foresight at the time to go, okay, I'm in a safe environment now, whether that's post mission back in the base or post deployment and back in Australia. I didn't have the clarity and the foresight or the advice to say, hey, we need to really unpack this. So I continued to suppress, and unfortunately, I started to use things like alcohol to suppress, to forget, to remember, to feel, to all those sort of things. So yeah, there's value in talking about these sort of things to say, hey, when you go through these experiences, hold off, continue, finish the mission, do what you need to do, deliver your product to market, and then at the end of it, go back and reflect, unpack,
Mm.
learn the lessons, talk, seek professional advice, whatever they are, counsel your team. It's a huge area and completely applicable to the business and the corporate world.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting what you said there, Ash, around it's okay to compartmentalize to get through to the other side. Because sometimes if we bring too much emotion into a situation, we actually need that emotional regulation to be able to be safe, get through, get to the outcome. But then it becomes a challenge when you don't then unpack it once you've got the space to do so. So I think it's
Yeah,
really sage advice when you say that. I guess you're pretty open about your experience with PTSD. And I think it's so important and brave for men in particular to speak about this
mm,
and to be vulnerable. It's a really tough challenge to face. And I think particularly in the context of the military, it's still at times a taboo subject, if I'm honest. I don't think we've come far enough in talking about mental health and
Yeah.
challenges. What strategies or support systems did you use to help you start to manage your PTSD? And how did you get the courage to speak so openly about it?
Yeah, firstly, I'd just like to touch. I completely agree that it is still there is still stigma involved with mental health, and I appreciate podcasts and platforms and people like you that are putting it out there to make it okay for people like myself and other people that have suffered from these things to speak about. So thank you. Um, Context is important too. So within a 6 month period, so 6 months in Afghanistan looked like for me, I was missed by a few millimeters from a Taliban sniper. So that was my first sort of within a couple of weeks, my first near-death experience. I was then a few months later blown up. Then a couple of weeks later, my son was born. So I missed the birth of my firstborn son. And then a month or so later, one of my best mates was killed in Afghanistan. I then rolled back into Australia, got off the plane, was pent up on adrenaline and anxiety and compartmentalizing all these situations to then be given a nearly 3 month old son and then say, okay, go and be dad.
Mm,
So to try and jump between what is a warrior in a combat situation to then trying to be a nurturing father, that was really, really challenging. What ultimately got me through was that I have been open and honest, and that allowed me to accept my situation and my mental health struggles, my PTSD that then looked like depression, and then ultimately looked like a suicide attempt. Um, and that's the reality of the situation. It was really really hard. You mentioned sort of the courage of it. I don't think I'm necessarily any braver than anyone else. I suffer from the fear of judgment, the fear of failure, the same as anyone else with these sort of things. But it allowed me, once I accepted it, said, okay, I do need to unpack these issues that I'm carrying. That made it a lot easier. I could then go, this is part of me, this is who I am, and I can
mm,
now help people to recognise that they have they have problems, but they're not a life sentence. It doesn't have to
mm.
be. It can be once you accept it and say, okay, this is me, and I am struggling with these symptoms and signs and sicknesses. Then it goes a long way to then remedying it, saying, right, I need to go and get this help and seek that professional help.
Mm. I just want to acknowledge and thank you for being so open and honest about that, Ash. And I'm so sorry you experienced that. It's awful to feel like you're in that place, to feel so alone and so down. So thank you. And I'm sorry that you had to experience that. I think what's so important about you sharing that, though, is for other men to hear that sadly they're not alone. It's not a good thing, but in a way, I think the vulnerability is that there's strength in vulnerability. And if there are people listening who are having mental health challenges at the moment, what do you have it? I don't like to use the word advice, because I think
Mm.
sometimes that can be a bit misconstrued. But is there anything that you'd say to them if they are sort of suffering through mental health at the moment in terms of the next steps or anything that might be helpful?
Look, my number one piece of advice is don't shy away from it. You're not any lesser of a man or woman for that fact. I don't want to
Mm,
take away from the women out there either. It often is challenging for men to put their hand up and say, I'm struggling, but the same for women, particularly in these high flying environments. The women are just as susceptible to it as well. Put your hand up and say, hey, I am struggling. And it doesn't have to be to the world. It doesn't have to be on this platform. It can be to your wife or husband, to your best friend, to
mm,
your GP, to your specialist, to anyone. It's a little bit of an old adage, but a problem shared is a problem halved. As soon as
mm,
you get that off and stop struggling within your own head, then the weight of the world starts to come off. And that person, they're most likely not going to be a medical professional, and they're most likely not going to have any experience in how to deal with it, but they will sit there. They will talk with you. They will care for you and love you and be a shoulder to cry on. And I've had many shoulders that I've needed to cry on, and that's okay too.
mm.
Like I'm not one to sit around and say men need to cry or whatever else, but sometimes you know what we do,
Yeah.
and that's okay too. It is what it is. It's part of life. It's part of growing. It's the journey.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, Ash. And I think the only thing I'd add to that is no one is ever a burden. You know, I think
Yeah,
sometimes people think I don't want to share this. I don't want to burden people with my problems, but actually no one's ever a burden and your loved ones are always there to listen. And so I think
that's
it's really
exactly right.
important.
And in my
Yeah.
experience, if every time, and initially I was only open with close friends, and more specifically, I could see myself in other people, and I knew that they were struggling. So
Mm,
it was easy for me to go into them and say, "Hey, I've got this going on," and 9 times out of 10, they would be like, "Hey, me too," or "I've got
mm,
something similar." Uh, Mental health is a problem for everyone. The same as physical health. You've got
mm,
diabetes, high blood pressure, broken arm. Sweet, we can talk about that. We don't talk about
mm.
depression or anxiety or PTSD or all those other things. They should be just a normal conversation.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more with you, Ash. I think the more we speak about it, the more people feel like they've got the ability to speak about it as well.
Mm.
So I appreciate you sharing that. Do you have things now that you do regularly, day to day, week to week, that help you keep on top of your mental health and keep you in a really mentally healthy place?
Look, for me, I'm a very physical person. So if I'm moving my body, uh, that gives me peace and happiness and the quiet time in my head. But
Mm,
also, and I'm sure we'll get to it, I'm deep in training for the English Channel crossing. So
yes.
those Ks and hours that I spend in the pool is my time to think and to process and to understand what's going on in my head. That's kind of my happy place.
Mm,
But even this morning, I was due a pool session, but I was fatigued and ruined from the week. So I went and sat by the beach and stretched. And that was
mm,
my quiet time to just go, okay, what's going on in your head? Do a little bit of a sanity check of my body and go, are you really physically struggling or mentally struggling? Or do we jump back in this afternoon and crack on? And that was the ultimate answer. So whilst people have huge goals and they're like, right, I need to be ruthless, you also need to be ruthless with giving yourself the time and you mentally sit there and go, right, let's understand exactly where I'm at. Am I pushing too hard that's going to be detrimental? And that's
mm.
where I was. So I took that time this morning, took one session off, which I'll make up this afternoon to go, right, this is where I'm at. This is what I need to do. And boom, let's jump back in.
Yeah. And do you know what? I love that, Ash. I think self-awareness is so important. And I've certainly been guilty of it in the past. Like I would hustle to the death. There was no way I was missing a 5:15 gym session, a run home, working God knows how many hours, logging on after I'd run home. And I think that self-awareness, just to be like, hold on a minute, what do I need? What does my body need? Is what true wellness is, right? Like
Yeah.
that's what it is. And it's not about being lazy or taking every session off, but it's being really honest with yourself and taking a moment to slow down and check in with yourself.
Yeah, that's right. It's not a backward step slowing down and checking
Mm,
in. It's actually going to be probably beneficial. And I mean, burnout is, I don't like buzzwords and keywords and that sort of
mm,
stuff, but it's a real thing.
yeah,
And then you get into that hustle and you almost become lonely because you're
yeah,
so involved in yourself that you forget about everyone else, everything else that's going on. And if we break it down, that's what's important. Whether it's your husband, wife, friends, family, children, greater community, you miss out on all that. So to take the minute to prioritize, be quite introspective and go, right, why am I doing all this stuff? Who am I
mm,
doing it for? Is it for me or is it for them? And that goes to another thing and a sort of a core pillar for me is being of service and
mm.
giving back in some way, shape or form. That is so important to me, and that allows me to be happy within myself to say, all right, I'm doing a whole lot of stuff for myself, but I'm also giving to others.
It's such a great point you raise, Ash, because I have suffered from anxiety for a long time, just since I was a kid. And the biggest way to overcome anxiety for me is doing something for someone else because
Yeah,
immediately you're out of your own head
yeah.
and whatever is going on there. And I think it's such a great tip for anyone who suffers from anxiety or some challenges with mental health. If you have the capacity to think for a moment and go and do something for something else, it's a really great way to get out of your own head as well.
And great point that if you have the capacity, sometimes we
Yeah.
just don't. So
Yeah.
don't frame it that you have to be doing something for someone else. If you've got the capacity, the time, the finance, the whatever it looks like, then do
Yeah.
it. But don't add to the pressure and the burden of dealing with your own hustle as well as trying to deal with someone else's.
Absolutely. And I think that's where it comes back to that self awareness, taking a moment to slow down and truly understand if you do or if you don't.
Completely
I
agree.
want to touch on your swim, your fin. You mentioned it a moment ago, your channel crossing. Tell us about what you're doing, why you're doing it, all of the information.
Look, I'll be completely open and honest. I have the time and the space right now because I was medically discharged from the military, and I'm on a medical pension. So I don't have to work right now, although I am launching a business and those sort of other things, but I have the financial freedom at the moment to be able to commit to doing something for others. And what that looks like is an English Channel swim, not quite a swim though. So what a swim looks like for me is lying on my back, kicking my legs, not using my arms, and that's how I'm getting across the English Channel. So that relates back to how we transit the water as a clearance diver. So if you've got a 30, 40, 50 kilo diving set on your back, that's how we transit around the surface of the water before we leave the surface and conduct our diving missions. So that's how it relates back, and that's why I'm doing it. So it's a charitable event to raise funds and awareness for the Navy Clearance Diving Trust. Um, I can't serve my country anymore because I was medically retired, but I can serve the people that still are, and that's hugely important to me. I've got the time, the space, so why can't I and why shouldn't I be giving back to someone or to something or an organisation or a group of people that I'm so passionate about?
I love that. How long is the English Channel, Ash? It's far. How far is
Yeah,
it?
so it's 34 kilometres across. You're looking at about 15 to 16 degrees water temperature, and I'd suggest it's probably going to be about 18 hours plus.
It's a long
Um,
time in the water.
yeah, especially my greatest fear for this undertaking is literally the water temperature.
Mm,
My mindset is very much taken from my time as a clearance diver that once you start something, you just do it until it's finished. It's very
yeah.
much a mission orientated mindset that I leave the sand on in the UK and I touch the sand in France, and
Mm,
there's nothing that will stop that other than hypothermia or something that really gets in my way that is I can't control.
yeah.
Um,
And tell us about the Clearance Diver Trust, Ash. So, what do they do? Who's the beneficiary of the trust? How does it work?
so the Navy Clearance Cyber Trust was set up. It's a not-for-profit set up to benefit the retiring and separated clearance divers. So should they fall in harm's way and lose their life, then it will support families. If they're in a time of need, then there's financial support. There's also, so I look at the proactive and reactive sides of it. There's also professional coaching that's available, and other support networks, and the provision of uh, introductions for people once they leave to then transition into that civilian sector that
Mm,
you look at most people, myself included. I joined as a 19-year-old boy effectively and left as a 40-year-old man and have had no experience in the corporate or civilian sector.
mm,
Um, there's a lot of similarities, but there's some people that just only know military, so they leave and
yeah.
that's all they know. So they walk into an interview for a role and they speak military, they talk military, and that just doesn't gel with the civilian
Mm.
world. So there's a lot of important networks that are able to be introduced and to provide for these people.
Yeah, that's great. And I think, I think it's so interesting because while there are a lot of similarities, there are a lot of differences as well. And I think the level of closeness that you have to your workmates in the military is very different to the corporate world. And I think that's something that a lot of people who transition from the military to the corporate world grapple with, that not
Yeah,
everyone has your best interest at heart in the corporate world. Like that is the facts. People have their
that's
own interests at heart and they're not your brothers or your mates who are tasked with also protecting your life. Whilst there's a lot of crossover, there is also a lot of challenge. And so I think it's awesome that there are systems in place to sort of help through the Clearance Cyber Trust because it can be really tough.
yeah, and that's a great way of explaining it, and that's exactly why I advocate for and volunteer within the trust. Is that I lived that life for 20 years, and I genuinely love the people that I worked with. They are my brothers and sisters that I will do anything for and will continue to support. You mentioned Liam before. We see each other rarely, but every time I see him, it's great to hug him and to
Mm.
remember working together and reminisce about all these sort of things. You've basically got a mateship or a brotherhood for life.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
And I think it's probably one of the things that's challenging about getting out because you don't necessarily have that when you go into the corporate world. It's a different environment. So whilst the skills translate, there's a different type of culture, I think, that comes through. I want to dive a little bit deeper into that. You're starting your own business called We Rise. Can you
Uh,
tell me a little bit about that and what that's going to look like?
Yes, I've co-founded We Rise Collective with a close friend, Justin Meredith. So Justin has a seasoned corporate background, and that complements and contrasts my military career nicely. That we can deliver a catchphrase and a key sort of delivery is that we can deliver lessons from the battlefield to the boardroom,
Mm,
and that works for both the corporate world that they can relate to Justin, but apply my lessons, tactics, strategies in a very different way that's very effective. As well as we sit at the lower end of also life and professional and even sports and motivational coaching. We don't
mm,
discriminate between any of those sectors because the theories, the strategies, the tactics, they're all exactly the same. You look at, and I don't want to sledge the coaching world, but people find their niches, which is absolutely fine. But when you unpack it, it's all the same.
yeah.
These people that are seeking these sort of professional coaching are people that are want to be high value contributors to whatever their situation, whether that's sport, corporate, military, or just a mum and dad who want to improve and set their goals
Mm,
and have those wins. So that's the angle that we come from. We want to walk alongside the journey with these people because we've lived that life and we have learnt the lessons, and it's no good keeping it to ourselves. And it goes back to that act of service. Whilst yes, it's a business and we want to make money from it, but
mm.
the joy of it is seeing others succeed.
What do you think are, maybe if we could say the top three lessons that you would take, I guess, using your words from the battlefield into the boardroom? If you were going into a leadership team, what are the top maybe two or three things that you would take that leadership team could apply from your experience in the military?
Great question and a good one to put me on the spot. Um, it's thriving under pressure, which there's probably your first lesson. You have to be able to commit and act when things get tough. Uh,
Mm,
Nothing changes. Your decision processes shouldn't change. Your clarity of thought shouldn't change just because the stress or the pressure is raising. Similar to what we're talking about with traits and characteristics of a clearance diver, that ability to make snap decisions with often little or no information.
mm,
As a leader and as a high playing team, they're crucial. You have to take the little information that you've got and make the best decision possible with that information. And guess what? It might not be the right decision sometimes, but you can revisit that, and it's you adapt and overcome. Again, there's that catchphrase. As more information comes in, you have the ability to change, alter, redirect that team or that decision. And sometimes you've got your minimum viable product that it
mm.
won't be the best answer, it won't be the gold level answer, but bring it to market and adapt as you go. So there's probably three straight off the top of
Yeah.
my head.
Well, and I think the beauty of taking particularly the quick decision making to the boardroom is that no one's life's at stake typically in the boardroom. So, the stakes, while I'm guilty of it, having been in corporate, thinking that was the most important decision that could ever be made. You get a bit caught up in it. But the reality is, and Liam used to say this to me, he's like, no one's going to die today, regardless of the
Yeah,
decision you make. And
yeah,
so I think it's always good to have that perspective as well. And to encourage, like you said, using that judgment to be able to make quick decisions on minimal information. Even if it does fail, that's another skill that you're learning as well. So I think that's a great tip.
that's right. And as often as leaders of teams, we are expected, and we put this pressure on ourselves to be the one that knows everything.
Mm,
Sometimes that's not just the way. So another lesson that I would suggest is very valuable is to look around your team. And I love to go to the most junior person, the most with the least experience, and say, "Hey, mate, what do you think?" Because
mm,
often they'll bring a brand new idea that you're like, "Oh, I've never thought of that." But
yeah.
someone with coming from an area with no knowledge will just bring that new idea, and you're like, "That's great. Maybe let's alter that and apply it." And it could be the make or break decision that this person's just brought to the table.
Yeah, it's a great tip actually, because I think typically greener team members don't have all of the sort of preconceived ideas of what something should be. They're able to think outside the box a little bit as
That's
well.
right.
So,
They're absent of bias of everything. They just
yeah.
here's my idea, take it or leave it, and they've got nothing to lose. They're already junior, so
Yeah.
what? Yeah,
So those are great tips, Ash. What about for individual listeners who are facing high pressure jobs? They're wanting to grow their careers. What's one practical step that you would suggest for them to take to build resilience and strengthen their mindset?
I love, and again, I try and avoid keywords, buzzwords, and resilience is one of them, but I love
Yes.
it. And look, it's something that, again, I could talk about for hours. Um, and my answer is continue to do hard things. Resilience is perishable. If you don't put yourself in challenging situations, then it will atrophy and die. It's like push-ups. You don't do them for a week, and guess what? You're back at square one.
Yeah.
That's my metaphor for life, really. Continue challenging yourself, growing, and building on that, because as soon as you stop, you die. So to clarify and to quantify, continue challenging, building, making hard decisions, doing hard things, and that goes back to this English Channel crossing. Like I said, I'm not working at the moment. We're building We Rise, which is a challenge. I've never built a business, so I'm putting myself in a completely unknown area. I've never swum the English Channel. Continue throwing yourself out there. Guess what? We'll fail, but those failures are lessons, and those failures turn into a success on the next task or the next job or the next risk that you take.
I love that, Ash. And it reminds me of a quote that comfortable is the enemy of great.
Yeah.
And I think it's so true. And it's really interesting. There is actually a part of your brain called the anterior mid-cingulate cortex. And if you do things you don't want to do and do hard things, this part of your brain actually physically grows. And that's a part of your brain that's responsible for willpower and motivation. So I think it speaks to exactly what you're saying. The more you do hard things that you don't want to do, physically, the more the ACC grows and the more you're likely to have more willpower and motivation. So there's science behind it, but I agree with you. It's actually interesting you say that because Liam and I have just signed up for an ultra marathon.
Nice.
You know, the big guy used to run them all the time, right? But
Yeah.
we haven't done a big run in ages. And I said to him, I think we're getting too comfortable. We need to do something hard again. And he was like, that's it. I found a 52K run. We're doing it. And I'm like, oh God, what have I signed up for? But it's exactly that, you know, noticing when you're feeling, and look, I've done a lot of things out of my comfort zone, starting businesses, podcasts, all that sort of stuff. But sometimes you actually need just a physical challenge as well to show you that can translate into building resilience and strength in the work as well.
And physical challenges are great. You sort of hit the nail on the head that you're not going to die. Go and put your body through these things, because by challenging your body, you're challenging your mind. Once you achieve, you come out with confidence. You're like, right, what's my next thing? And you also said, and it's one of my mantras, is do hard things. I live by that, and I say it to people. They're like, well, what should I do? I'm like, find something hard and do it. One of my best mates, who is a high flyer, looked at me and he's like, why are you doing that? Why don't you just sit back and rest on your laurels? You've had a good career. You're starting a business. You can never sit back and rest. Just do hard things.
I think it's so true. And to your point, it is proof to ourselves that we're worthy and that we can do hard things too. So I think it's really good for our mental health as well as our mindset, as humbling as it is starting something new. That's hard.
Yeah, and that's our fear of failure and our ego kicking in, isn't it?
For sure.
What if I don't crush this? Then is that a comment on me as a person? It's not.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's definitely the ego. We ran 6Ks the other day and I was like, my God, how did I used to run 35Ks on a Sunday?
Yeah.
You know, it's the ego. And I'm like, oh, well, you just got to start from scratch again.
That's that perishable sort of skill, isn't it?
For sure. Absolutely. Yep. What's next for you, Ash? So you mentioned obviously the Channel Swim and building your business, but what are you looking most forward to coming up?
Look, they're the two big ones for me. We Rise is a huge goal of mine to build the business, to start making a dent in the world. Bringing that positivity, bringing our lessons to individuals, to teams, to organizations, and saying, hey, let's make you a better person or a more productive or a more profitable business. Whatever that key word is to getting them to the next level, that's what I want to do and who I am. I've learned lessons the hard way, that if I can help people and use that experience to help them get to where they need to be, then that's really my passion. The English Channel is sort of a mechanism of that it's me practicing what I preach. I can't sit here and say, you should go and do this, and then sit back in the comfy chair and not do it myself. So those are my for this year. So the swim is in June, and then the business creation will be ongoing. So that's my goals for this year.
That's awesome. Where can the listeners find you, Ash? Is there a link for us to follow for your swim? Do you have an Instagram for We Rise? Where can everyone find you?
So Ash Semmens at Instagram, Ash Semmens on Facebook, We Rise Collective on Instagram and LinkedIn. That's where we have most of our content at this stage.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining me today, Ash. I feel like there has been so many wonderful tips that you have shared in terms of taking the lessons that you've learned in your military career and then applying those to a work perspective, but also just your candor and vulnerability in sharing your mental health journey. And I truly believe that the more we share stories, the more we can help save lives. And I think you're absolutely doing that. So I appreciate your vulnerability and sharing. And thank you for joining me.
Look, thank you. And like I said before, thank you for providing this platform for people like me to tell the story, but more importantly for the listeners to tune in and learn the lessons from not just me. I'm just some guy that played in military games, but for all the people that you have on talking about their stories, you can only learn and grow from them. So thank you.
Thanks, Ash.
Thanks for joining me on Work and Wellness. If today's episode resonated with you, remember, someone in your network might need to hear this too. Share it with a colleague or friend who could use these insights. I'd love to keep the conversation going, so find us on Instagram at Mind Your Grit, where we share daily tips and continue these discussions. And if you found value in today's episode, please take time to rate and review the show. It makes such a huge difference and helps other people discover conversations they might really need. Don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. Each week, we're building a community of people who believe that success and well-being go hand in hand. You can find the notes, resources, and links from today's episode at mindyourgrit.com. This is Work and Wellness with Ange Davis. Your work matters, your wellness matters, and this is where it all comes together. See you next week.